Hello everyone. Today's presentation will cover attachment and emotion during infancy. And to start out with, in our discussion of attachment, the game of Bungy Baby is played out in public places everywhere between parents and their children and offer more of this type of observation or example that we can use to demonstrate some of the things that we'll be discussing in our presentation today. And so you can go to a place where parents and young children are anywhere from toddlers to up to the age of 3, so more so infants to the age of 3, to see this in action. With Bungy Baby, there's a hypothetical cord that links primary caregivers to their 1.5 to 3-year-old kid. The caretaker serves as home base. The child will go out and explore, then come back to check in, then go out to explore, then come back to check in, and so on and so forth. And within this type of example, it is bidirectional in the sense that it works both ways and is beneficial to both the child and the parent. So the caretaker and the child are monitoring each other, and if the child gets too far away from the parent, then the parent comes closer and vice versa. So this phenomenon depends heavily on the comfort level of the parent or the perceived safety of the environment and the approach tendencies of the child. And so you can just think of this example throughout this whole presentation and think about this bidirectional relationship between the caretaker, the caregiver, and the child. And so this is kind of something that you should be thinking about throughout this presentation again. And so these interactions between individuals is described in the chapter as attachment. So Freud and Erikson had attachment theories too, but we're going to focus on Bowlby, who's the most widely accepted and used theory on attachment. So John Bowlby, together with his assistant Mary Ainsworth, were the first to experimentally explore attachment relationships between parents and young children. And attachments can be made with more than just one person, those other than just your relatives, and it could even include your pet fish. So they occur in which there is a reciprocal type of relationship in which both individuals depend on one another or interact with one another. In this example, the attachment and quality of the parent-child interaction is dependent on their characteristics. So characteristics of the parent and characteristics of the child, and how these characteristics interact with one another. For example, if the parent is loving and sets limits with their child, and their child is compliant to their demands, then their interaction and attachment is most likely secure or adaptive. The same can be said for the opposite type of parenting strategies and non-compliant, aggressive, or hyperactive children, as you can imagine. So attachments are therefore characterized by their interactional synchrony, in which the participants adjust their behavior in response to their partner's emotions or actions. And so that is essentially what we're looking at with attachment. And given this understanding of attachment, how do we know what we know, and what does that look like comparatively to other species? So you may ask, why would we even care about other animals or animal models in general? Animals can serve as a model for aspects of our own development and behavior, as there are commonalities within all mammalian species, particularly those that are closely related to us. Highlights that we have learned from animal models focus on our early social environment as particularly critical for many mammals, especially primates like us. This is due to our brain plasticity, which is key in adapting to the social world that's around us. In other words, early experiences or learning significantly impact our adaptability and socialization that we have later in life. So this was actually demonstrated by Harry Harlow, who conducted a series of experiments in which he found that it is not food that links a baby primate to its mother, but rather her warmth and the physical contact, so much so that they would forego food or obtain food and go back to the more nurturing, warm mother. Overall, what we learned is that babies are not simply attached to mothers because they are a source of food, but that the social and emotional aspects are almost equally as important as food. Along those lines, it's no mistake that young mammals come into the world with features that make them look more adorable or helpless. These characteristics actually help to ensure that they will be taken care of. And this is known as the Cupid doll effect, in which they have infants and toddlers have large eyes or round head, a small round nose, and a small mouth. We see these characteristics also in chimps. So this mechanism is bidirectional in nature, and this can be seen in which infants engage in a type of bias in which they attend more readily to human faces, which reinforces and increases the odds of encouraging affection from their caregiver. So once infants have formed an attachment to someone or a set of individuals, they become aware that they can lose their attachment figure and become better able to discriminate between familiar faces from those who are unfamiliar. This comes out in the form of stranger anxiety, in which infants and toddlers display negative reactions like acting standoffish, being hesitant, or even crying when approached by an unfamiliar person. This is also known as the type of stranger danger and is adaptive, given that it will bring attention to the infant and the individual approaching them. So you also see separation anxiety, where the infant or toddler have negative reactions to being separated from their caregiver or close one. So these aid in fostering that relationship between the child and the caregiver. But you can also see that when it becomes these anxieties carry on or over to when the child is older, then you start to see some more pathology. So Bowlby and Ainsworth use these natural anxieties to assess the quality of the attachment relationship. And so they defined 4 types of attachment relationships. The first one is secure, and this is where the child welcomes contact with the attachment figure and uses the person as a secure base for exploration. They may or may not be distressed by separation from the caregiver, but welcomes contact and is soothed by the return of the attachment figure if they left the room. The second one is resistant, and so where there's a strong separation anxiety or protest, these children often have the tendency to remain near their caregiver but resist contact after separation. The third is avoidant, and this is where you start to see little separation protest from the toddler and a tendency for the child to avoid or even ignore the caregiver once they return back into the room. The fourth is disorganized or disoriented, in which the infant has almost a dazed appearance when the caregiver returns back to the room and has a tendency to first seek out and then abruptly avoid any contact with the caregiver after separation. So most notable, it has been demonstrated that children who have a history of physical abuse actually show the profile of disorganized or disoriented type behavior or attachment. So kids with secure attachments are found later to have better social skills, be more adept at identifying others' emotions and responding appropriately to them, like comforting a friend who is sad, for example. Although there are no differences in IQ between securely attached or even insecurely attached children, those with secure attachments tend to do better in school. And you may ask, why is this? It's most likely because they are secure enough to devote effort to academic endeavors, and they're not worried about getting their emotional needs met. So children with difficult temperaments are more likely to become insecurely attached. And going back to the bidirectionality of their relationship, we understand this as a difficult temperament child probably results in higher demands on the caregiver to deal with a kiddo that, for example, throws temper tantrums quite frequently. And so this is not to mention their negative interactions with their siblings, so they might start arguments or fights with their siblings, and so it's just making for more of a chaotic environment. So if if the caregiver is not sensitive to these demands of this particular child, it can result in miscommunication between the parent and the child, negative parenting strategies like yelling or corporal punishment like spanking, and or frustration on both sides of the caregiver and the child. So caregiver characteristics that impact their sensitivity includes higher stress levels due to being overworked, negative interactions with their child, or even conflict between parents. And so even more so compounding this environmental context is the pathology of parents that they may have in their own history, particularly maternal depression, among others, is particularly important to consider within this example, because mothers on average are spending more time with children, and so therefore you can start to see more of an impact of their pathology, the depression, on children's behavior. And so you can imagine that mothers who are experiencing high levels of pathology such as depression may not be, if you think back to those symptoms of depression, they may not be interacting or have quality interactions with their child. So this is also impacting attachment quality. Something that we have to think about is emotional deprivation. So some examples of this include older studies on Romanian orphans who had little contact with anyone and were practically unattached to anyone while being raised. So results indicated that the longer that the children were institutionalized, the more difficulty they seemed to have when adopted due to lacking social skills and being quickly overwhelmed by social stimulation in their environment. So this is very similar to animal models that were shown by Harlow. As a result, this highlighted sensitive periods for recovery of these skills they did not learn or receive during their earlier experiences in the orphanage. So if they were adopted into a nurturing environment, there were more positive outcomes such as gaining or learning those social skills and being able to or learning how to regulate their emotions if adopted within the first 2 years of age. And so that's where we start to see that sensitive period. If they weren't adopted within those first 2 years, there was a significant decline in the children's ability to learn those skills. So you can see the same process in children who have been or have significant histories, trauma histories of being abused and neglected. So in comparison to typically developing children, this particular population is more likely to have difficulty forming attachments, lack empathy, especially for those kiddos that have been physically abused, and to have poor social skills and or rejection from peers because of that poor social skill development. So you start to see this almost trickling down effect of specific behaviors and how it impacts not only the caregiver but also the child and how they interact with their environment. And so to sum up what's needed for the formation of secure attachments, genetics and environment, including prenatal environment, which we talked about in previous discussions, predispose the infant to an emotional skill set and resiliency in their ability to handle stress. And on top of that, there are a lot of different factors that contribute to attachment. So an important consideration to make is that one important consideration to have, given all of this significant impact that parents have on children, is to note that just one mistake in parenting is not going to completely screw up the kid, or you see this titration of negative impacts from just parenting alone. There are several different factors that are impacting an individual's behavior. And so based on the developmental cascade model or even the biopsychosocial model, there are connections across domains over time which ultimately influence developmental pathways and outcomes for the individual. So thus, biology, cognition, social emotional processes, family, peers, school, culture all impact human behavior. And so human infants and their parents are actually designed to form these attachments. And the same is true in other social species, though no species is as social as humans and has as many outcomes that are dependent on the quality of the social interaction and social environment as humans do. So attachment serves as an objective, or more so obvious, adaptive value in which they ensure that parents will be motivated to actually care for their very dependent and often helpless offspring. And so from the child's perspective, attachments ensure that they will not wander too far from the security of their parents and will continue to elicit that care from parents and other invested caregivers. And so you start to see how this almost anti behavior is very adaptive for children. So if you have any contact with children, you probably observe that children are very, very good at getting adults to attach to them. So what does this tell us about human nature? Attachments are in line with the major task of development for social species like humans. Human infants monitor their social environment and use the plastic developmental period to modify their cognitions, their behaviors, and their emotions so that they're in line with the demands of the social environment. Even insecure attachments can have adaptive value when we're really looking at it to some extent, in that they are a product of the infant adapting to the demands of their environment, and which is adaptable to ensure that they survive within that particular environment. So if that environment is unpredictable or even harsh, it may be more advantageous for that child to always monitor the whereabouts of their parents more closely in the case of resistant attachments, or even avoid the caregivers until they get a sense of the mood of the parent in the home. So you can start to see how we as human species are adapting our behavior to fit within our particular environment. All right. And so when considering attachment styles across cultures, we see that different cultures place different demands in the parent-child relationship, such that those that strongly emphasize independence, like Germany and the U.S., have more infants with avoidant attachment patterns, whereas those cultures that rarely leave their children with substitute caregivers or maybe even extended family members, such as in the practice within Japan, have more babies with resistant attachments. And so switching gears and talking about emotional development, but still on that idea of this bidirectional relationship, and then also just overall development within infancy. At birth, infants have the ability to show interest, distress, disgust, and contentment. And at about 2 to 7 months, we start to see these primary emotions develop. So the primary emotions include anger, sadness, joy, surprise, interest, and fear. And these primary emotions are biologically programmed and can be observed in all typically developing infants at about the same time and are universal across cultures. And so positive emotions like smiling and laughing actually develop later in development and incidentally are not directly relevant to survival as those primary emotions are. So jealousy, empathy, embarrassment, pride, shame, guilt develop actually within the first 2 years during the second half of the first year of life or even later. So there are primarily two means by which infants and young children begin to understand emotional appropriateness. And so they use social referencing and the use of others' emotional expressions to infer the meaning of otherwise ambiguous situations. So infants and young children will do this actually spontaneously, and parents and other caregivers are usually reliable sources about potential threats and the opportunities to explore, and so on and so forth. And so questions they may be referencing to their parents, as in the picture with the little baby looking at her mother when she's in the doctor's office. Is this person safe? How should I react? And so what they do is that they look to their caregivers. So during the first year, infants will reference caregivers or other companions prior to acting. During the second year, children will often reference others after they've appraised the situation that they're in, and they'll reference their caregivers in order to assess the accuracy of their own judgment. So understanding how others respond to situations and when such a response is appropriate leads to the ability to actually regulate your emotions. Should I be more scared, or should I dial back on my fear of this particular situation because mom or dad don't look as scared as I appraised it to be? So this is very difficult for very young infants, and infant boys actually have a harder time regulating negative arousal than do infant girls, and will often fuss and cry more than girls in an attempt to elicit regulatory support from their caregivers. So this is an important point in that caregivers are a source of emotional regulation for children. So when caregivers cannot adequately regulate or even control their own negative emotions, not surprisingly, children have a difficult time learning to do this also. And so around 1 year old, children are beginning to develop strategies to deal with negative emotions like rocking themselves, chewing or mouthing on objects, moving away from upsetting people or objects. And between 18 to 24 months, toddlers are trying to control the actions of other people or objects that upset them and are beginning to cope with frustrations of having to wait their turn. However, most children find it almost impossible to regulate fear. In a study by Buss and Goldsmith, even those who were reinforced or taught to regulate their fear actually couldn't do it. Instead, they developed methods for expressing their fear. So this in turn is adaptive as we consider it within normal limits. It's helpful to our own survival of evaluating people and evaluating situations for risk. So the development of emotions is impacted by temperament, which is composed of several different things that are listed on the particular slide. And so this includes pace or rigor of activities in children, how easily or intensely upset one becomes over negative events, the ease with which one calms after becoming upset or returning to that baseline, their approach or withdrawal within new or novel situations, and their receptiveness to social situation and also isolation. And so descriptions of temperaments is described in 4 different clusters of behavior, including easy, where infants and toddlers are even-tempered, they're easygoing, they have a predominantly positive mood, they're open and adaptable to new experiences, and they have a regular pattern of eating, sleeping, and bowel movements. So the majority of children are actually classified as this type of temperament. The second classification is difficult, and you probably have heard parents or others describe babies in these particular ways. Oh, that baby has difficult or is difficult. And so these children are active, irritable, and have irregular patterns. So they have intense reactions to changes in routine, to new situations, new people, or novelty in just general terms. We also see slow to warm, so these children are inactive, a little moody, somewhat slow to adapt to new people or situations. They're different from difficult children in the intensity with which they react negatively. So they may resist a situation by simply avoiding it and looking away, rather than those kiddos that have difficult temperament in which they would probably be kicking and screaming. And so individuals that are or kiddos that are slow to warm are slow to warm up to novelty, but they have to check the situation out first. So you could almost describe it as more of an anxious type behavior. So the remaining 35 is actually not classifiable, most likely because they don't fall into only one of these categories, but rather a combination of some of these categories. So if your temperament affects which situations you will react to and with what intensity you'll actually react to it, how stable is this pattern of reaction over the course of development? Several attributes of temperament are actually moderately stable over the course of development, specifically for ages that you would see or characteristics that you would see between the ages of 3 and 18. So such stability lends to temperament being the foundation for later childhood and actually into adulthood, the characteristics that we would see in your personality traits. And so behavioral inhibition, which was coined by Kagan, refers to the tendency to withdraw from unfamiliar people or situations. And behaviorally inhibited, there we go, toddlers appear shy and even fearful. So around school age, about 5 to 7 years, these children were less sociable with strange adults and peers and more cautious about engaging in activities that involved any element of risk. And so we also see that behavioral inhibition is known to have deep biological roots and are shown in studies of infants using EEGs to record electrical activity in their brain. So infants easily upset by novelty or new situations have greater right frontal lobe activity within their brains, whereas infants who are generally more positive have greater left frontal lobe activation. So it's also been shown to be genetically influenced so that it runs in families. Children at the extreme ends are most likely to be stable over the course of development. So specifically, the most inhibited children that are incredibly shy or more shy, and the most uninhibited, so those kiddos that are hyperactive or lack impulse control, or even surgent children that are that have this high approach to novelty. They're very interested in new situations and new people. They score very low in terms of fear and high on sociability, are most likely to remain so as they develop into adulthood. So in Western cultures like the U.S., surgent children usually do well because their behavior is usually in line with cultural success, such as individualism, being ambitious, being industrious. So this makes sense, seeing that these children and later adults usually develop social skills faster than their peers because they are less fearful. They tend to put themselves in situations that would be conducive to learning experiences in this social realm, usually because they aren't afraid to mess up. And so, however, children who lack these social skills and are surgent often end up being rejected by peers, really want to be with people but really don't have those social skills to do so, and they often come off as annoying. For behaviorally inhibited children, outcomes depend greatly on the amount of social support in their environment. Examples of this include supportive, nurturing parents who encourage exploration as at their child's pace and not forcing them to socialize will provide for better outcomes. And also, just a note on there's a fine balance between supporting them but not being too lax in their parenting, while encouraging socialization but not forcing them into a situation, because either extreme is unhelpful to the child's development. So, can difficult temperaments ever be adaptive? The answer is yes, or else they would have been selected out of our behavior. So Thomas and Chess, temperament researchers, propose the idea of goodness of fit. So this refers to the quality of the match between the child's temperament and the demands of the environment. So the environment can either be of the larger culture, or as we talked about those behaviorally inhibited, the environment can either be the larger culture, or as we talked about for those kiddos that are behaviorally inhibited, can be their home environment. Their supportiveness of parents actually greatly aids these children in finding appropriate niches. So no, they will never be insurgent, but they can still be well-adjusted children. So some of you may be surprised that surgent temperaments are not always favored. And so in our culture, we tend to value individual achievement, extroversion, and individualism, all things that are consistent with surgency and easy temperaments, probably termed easy because of our own cultural biases that we have within the U.S. And some culture societies, especially agricultural societies in Kenya, you start to see this environment as relatively hostile, unpredictable environment where children with difficult temperaments, and I use that term like with quotes, so difficult temperaments have higher survival rates, and you start to see that they may engage in crying more often, but that's adaptable for them because then they get fed and they're attended to more because they have that temperament. So again, you'll start to see this goodness of fit for temperaments matching their environment. So many Asian cultures value collectivism, lack of individual achievement, and respect and obedience to authority. In these cultures, behavioral inhibition is seen as a valuable trait, and these cultures want kids to be more fearful, inhibited, wait for others to check out the situation for them. So surgency is actually seen as maladaptive, and in that culture, surgent kids are the least well adjusted. So the adaptive value of temperamental files not only depends on the match between a child and his or her home environment, but also those of the wider culture or environment, to the extent that one's temperament allows them to adjust to the demands of that environment. And we ultimately get this match or goodness of fit.